Hello, and welcome to Make a Difference, the show about how volunteers are making a difference every day right here in Montgomery County. I'm your host, Sandy Smith, and we welcome you here once again via Zoom. October is well known as Breast Cancer Awareness Month. It is also Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Today, our special guest and first-time guest, Leslie A. Hawes, Esquire, Executive Director of Court Watch Montgomery. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you for having me, Sandy.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm very excited about this discussion. So why don't you tell us, Leslie, how Court Watch Montgomery came into existence and your mission?
Sure. We came into existence over a decade ago in 2011 when two victim advocates who were going to court with survivors of domestic violence realized that there were some shortcomings in the processes and procedures in our courts in Montgomery County. So they founded Court Watch to be a monitoring nonprofit and a reporting nonprofit that would send cadre of trained volunteers into our courtrooms to be the eyes and ears on the courts, gather very specific data, and then turn that data into reports to show where the processes and procedures can be improved and to advocate for change. Since that time, we have monitored over 11,000 protective order hearings in domestic violence cases in Montgomery County.
So what is the importance of having advocates for the survivors in the courtroom?
Well, we don't actually advocate for the survivors. We are court monitors. And the importance being is that we are the only agency in Maryland who does this type of work. So without our volunteers in the courtrooms, there is no way for the community to know whether, for example, staggered exits are being implemented. And what do I mean by staggered exits? Staggered exits is a nationally recognized best practice where a petitioner or a victim seeking a protective order is allowed to leave the courthouse 15 minutes before the respondent. What this does is allows all parties to safely exit the courtroom, get to their transportation, and greatly minimizes the chances of confrontation between the parties. So without some agency like Court Watch to go in and see what's happening in the courtroom, things such as staggered exits, no one would know if they're being implemented. And that's actually a very good example because when Court Watch first started reporting on staggered exits in 2012, the implementation rate was 15%. When we reported on them and the Washington Post picked it up, the implementation rate went up to 75%. So what we see is every time we report on something like staggered exit, it reminds the court, reminds the judiciary, reminds the bailiffs to implement the practice, which is frankly free and fairly easy to do. So that's why Court Watch and its volunteers are so important.
So what would a typical day look like for a volunteer as a court monitor? When you say, for example, with the standard practices, you have a court monitor observing, and then what do they do? Do they write reports? Do they speak directly to the judge or the bailiff? What does that look like?
Great question, Sandy. So they do not speak to the judge. We go into court. They know who we are. The bailiffs all know the Court Watch folks that come in. And we monitor in a minimum of teams of 2. And the reason we do that is there's a lot going on in the court. There's a lot on the docket. There's a lot of parties. Once a protective order is issued, the parties have to sit in the courtroom and wait for the clerk to issue that order. So there's a lot to keep track of who's getting a protective order and when they leave the courtroom. And there's another reason is that we have a very detailed form of information that we collect when we're in court. We collect, for example, is the petitioner a male or a female? What is the relationship between the parties? Did the judge ask the respondent if the protective order is issued, does he or she have a firearm? because under Maryland law, they're required to turn that firearm over to the sheriff while the protective order is pending. So it's a lot of really detailed but important information that our volunteers collect. So that's why we monitor in teams of 2. So they'll show up to either the Rockville courthouse or the Silver Spring courthouse at about 8:30 in the morning, collect the domestic violence docket, sit in the courtroom for however long that docket lasts. Both volunteers will each fill out a form for every hearing. And then after the docket is over, they will convene outside of the courtroom, compare forms, and then submit one master form for every hearing. And that is one way we make sure our data is very, very accurate. Those forms then are transferred to our data person at CourtWatch. She's very highly trained. She looks over the forms for accuracy, uploads them into our system. And then me as the executive director and many of the folks on my board who are very, very skilled in this area look at the data. We look at the trends, we look at what's going right, what's going wrong, and then we write and issue the reports that are put out by CourtWatch.
Okay, so the volunteer actually wouldn't have any direct contact with, say, the survivors or the courtroom personnel other than, hello, because they've seen you before. That
Correct.
being said, what types of people would make good volunteers for your organizations? Your organization, are there any special skills that you are looking for?
But not really. We're really just looking for folks that are very dedicated and interested in our mission. Unfortunately, when the courts closed during COVID, we lost a lot of our volunteers.
Yeah.
A lot of our volunteers pre-COVID were retired and understandably were reticent to go back into the courtroom post-COVID. So we use that as an opportunity to recruit new volunteers. And what we're finding is our new volunteers are a bit more diverse in terms of age and background and ethnicity. So while we are very, very particular about being accurate in our data collection, it is still a human data collection process. So I am a firm believer that diversity in our volunteer pool is key, that all voices should be in the room in terms of collecting data in the courtroom, because there are different perspectives on what is occurring and what should be done better. So we're really just looking for folks who are free on a weekday morning. We do look to do it at least once a month from 8 to 12 to go down and really just put eyes and ears on the court and know that the information that you'd be collecting will have a direct impact on what's going on in our courts. And one example I'll give you is we just issued our most recent report on staggered exits, wherein we showed that the courts were still only implementing that practice 39% of the time.
Even though it's the law that they're supposed to have that in place in all courtrooms in Montgomery County.
It is a best practice. It is not a law. It is a best practice. But I will say, to great credit of the judiciary and the chief administrative judge, she had a meeting with us about a month ago, read our report, has met with the judges, met with the bailiffs, and we are seeing much higher rates of implementation of staggered exits. Right. So when we talk about who we want for volunteers, we want people who are interested in our mission and interested in seeing the results of their hard work sitting in court every day.
That's fantastic. A lot of times you do volunteer work, but you don't actually see the end result or the people that you're actually helping. So that's great. So I am very familiar with CourtWatch as far as the volunteer aspect. And I know that you do provide extensive training for the volunteers, which is great because, people aren't just, coming off the street and going into the courtroom. So that's wonderful. Do you have a specific commitment? The volunteers have a commitment of time for the training that they need to complete. So tell me a little bit about that. What type of time commitment are you looking at?
That's a great question, Sandy. So we have a pretty evolved training program that we've honed over the years. It's a 4-part training. 2 parts are over Zoom and 2 parts are in person. Okay. So the first part is basically what is domestic violence, what are protective orders, basically the nuts and bolts for folks that are not trained attorneys. In fact, 99% of our volunteers are not attorneys, and some have never even been in court before. So that is definitely not a prerequisite. We will walk you through all the nuts and bolts of what will happen in court. Then part 2, we take you to court with one of our seasoned volunteers, which oftentimes is one of our board members. Our board members are very active. They will sit in court with you. They will show you exactly how to fill out the forms, answer any questions that you have. Then part 3, we go back on Zoom again. We take a quiz to make sure, it's upgraded, but just to make sure everybody's understanding what they're hearing and to make sure that all of their questions are being heard. And then finally, you go back into court with Sarah, our data analyst, because she's the ones that receives the forms and reviews them, just to make sure everybody understands what's going on. And then after that 4th part training, we do ask you to sign up for court. We would like you for folks to do it a minimum of once a month, but a lot of our volunteers do it 2-3 times a month. And they oftentimes find another volunteer who they very much like. And then those two will often pair up together, which is just terrific. So, and then we also do refresher trainings, and we're always available for questions. And so I don't think our volunteers feel like they're thrown in untrained at all.
Are there any volunteer opportunities that are virtual for those that maybe are nervous about going into court or just nervous about being, in that type of close environment? Maybe they're still a little leery about COVID. Do you have those virtual opportunities?
We do. So we have several volunteers who work with our data analyst, who review forms and help input all of the information into the technical spreadsheets and online. And some of those folks do so just because they really like data. That's sort of their wheelhouse. Yes. And so we do have folks that do that virtually, and they are a tremendous, tremendous help to us.
If you're interested in being a volunteer, how do they get in contact with your organization?
Courtwatchmontgomery.org. That is our website. My email is on there. My cell phone is not on there, as well as our rock star volunteer coordinator, Amy Cass, who the volunteers absolutely love her. She puts all the training together. She walks you through. And even after you become a trained volunteer, she's constantly in contact with you. In fact, I just came from one of our monthly volunteer coffees that we have at Panera. We had about 20 volunteers show up. So it's not just about the mission at Court Watch. We're actually a really tight group, and it's a great place to meet other like-minded folks.
Amy's fantastic. I do love her too. We've been speaking with Leslie A. Hawes. Thank you for your time today, Leslie.
Thank you, Sandy. This has been wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. If you're interested in volunteer opportunities, please go to our website, montgomeryserves.org. I'm your host, Sandy Smith, and thank you for joining us today. And let's protect one another, and let's be sure to make a difference.
Honey, what I think you need is a socket wrench.
I played JV basketball.
I'm sorry. I don't think it looks right.
This is good, and it's all good, baby.
Is it really all good?
If you love me enough to routinely test your handyman skills, not to mention the strength of your marriage, then of course you'll visit nhtsa.gov/the-right-seat to make sure I'm in the right car seat.
I'm gonna call my dad.
If I could go back and change it all, I would. I think I'm gonna miss you the most. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Maybe it's just the little moments. If I could go back and change it all, if I could go back, I would. But I can't.